Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Gray and this is another episode of the Gray F podcast. And today we have another exciting guest by the name of Melissa Haynes. Some of you are familiar with her TED Talk about courage and her story of going to Africa and, being in the jungle, with the animals and stuff like that. And today we go in detail with her whole story, which is very courageous. So this is about courage, and she shares about her book and her experiences in South Africa. She had a dream to see the big five or the huge animals that she used to look at in the magazines. And 20 plus years later, she did it. So it's a very fun story. And the book is called Learning How to Play with the Lion's Testicles. She wrote it a few years ago, but I guess playing with the lion testicles is something that most of you would want to try. I certainly wouldn't. The whole story happened in South Africa, where she came to play with the lion's testicles. I live in South Africa, but I've never attempted such a thing, and I more likely wouldn't. But it seems like most of you guys who come from America or Europe, you like to come and play with the animals and stuff. I don't really recommend that. And for those of you who have never been to Africa, just because people come here to see the animals doesn't mean that it's a jungle everywhere here. I've certainly never been close to animals myself. I'm scared like shitless with that stuff. Anyway, so just going to give you a little bit more info about Melissa in case you don't know. Melissa Haynes studied business at BCIT and Thompson Rivers University, where she graduated with honors. In her previous life, she worked in advertising and ran a business in Central America. She was a project manager for the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver. She ghostwrote a column about entertaining in the Vancouver Courier and a chapter in the award-winning Chef's Cookbook inside the recipe box. And she has been featured on Ellen, the TV show, on Jimmy Fallon. There's a story also with Jimmy Fallon and Melissa, which you hear in the story. And she just did a TED Talk, I think, that you can check out. I'll put the link in the description. I enjoyed watching that. I certainly recommend that. Now, another thing that I want to point out before we start. Thank you, everyone, for all the messages you sent me prior to the previous podcast episode I did with Susan Bennett, who is the original voice of Siri. And some of you pointed things out like I shouldn't be using the word right a lot when I'm interacting with my guests because it kind of sounds condescending, something like that. I totally thank you for bringing that up, and I'll make sure I don't do that as much. Now I'm looking for a new slur that I'll be using when I'm interacting with people. And if you have anything else to say, I totally welcome that you point out the things that I can change and improve on the podcast. And if you haven't checked out that podcast episode, it's just the previous one, episode 52. I recommend you see it. Right. I shouldn't be saying right, but I just said it. Damn it, Gray. And now, another thing that I want to share with you guys is that I'm starting a new startup in Cape Town, South Africa, but it doesn't really matter. It's global. So it's still in the beginning phases, but I've done some of the groundwork already, which was important to find the right partnerships with the people that have the infrastructure that I need to make those things happen. So I've managed to pull out all those important partnerships, and I will be sharing more about that startup business in the next coming episodes. I can't really share more about the idea and all these kind of things at this point. But I just thought that it's a good way to communicate with some of you who are experienced in that area or in business in general. And some of you who aren't, then we can share, we can talk about it, you can advise, and at a later stage we can evaluate the progress. So I'll be totally candid about it. We'll be sharing everything, what's going on. And I hope we can all benefit from that. And I expect to benefit from some of you who are experienced in business. And another thing that I want to say before we start is I some have been requesting a few people that have been on the podcast before to, meaning I should get them back for a return episode. I have a few that I would definitely want to speak to again. Not really a few, it's a number of them. But what I want to do, I'll do it based on the numbers. So it's better that you tell me who you think should be back and what we should talk about, and then I'll base it on the numbers. The people that gets the most votes will be requested to be back on the podcast. So you can do it in many ways. You can comment in this episode, or you can send me an email through my website, www.greyjabesi.com, which is GreyJabesi.com. And then you will be able to email me. And for this whole progress about my startup that I've been talking about, the best way to do it is to subscribe to the podcast as well. So if you go to my website, you can go to subscribe, and then you just punch in your email address. I'll be sending you new podcasts when they're up, and as well as communicate all these other things that I think are important. Some of you are subscribed on iTunes and SoundCloud. I'm totally aware of that. But I recommend that you also subscribe to the podcast on via email, which is on the website. Anyway, enough talking. Let's get back into this episode with Melissa. It's totally exciting. It's a story about courage, and I hope you pick up something from it, and you become courageous enough to have the courage, and to play with the lion's testicle and go after the things that you want. Quickly, before I forget as well, Melissa just sent me one thing that she wanted to share in the podcast, but she didn't have the chance to. So she said, one thing I wanted to leave your listeners with, but didn't say, was play. P, and she's using P as an acronym, and P is for give yourself permission to try to do the thing you want, do or say. Lay low, L is for lay low. Don't tell people what you're going to do. Tell them what you did. That way you won't be bogged down by their doubts and fears. Oh my gosh, I just told you about my startup. I feel like a loser. I didn't do play properly. Anyway. And A is for acknowledge resistance, the inner critic. When it shows up in the form of excuses, doubts, fears, that's a sign that you're doing something that's important to you, and something your inner critic is threatened by. It's meaningful, so pursue it. And Y is for why not. You are worthy and deserve to pursue the things of importance to you. You are worthy enough to be given the gift of life. Have the courage to overcome resistance and play. With that, I welcome you, Melissa Haynes. Enjoy the podcast.
Yeah, I recently gave a TEDx talk called The Secret to Achievers, Conquerors, and Living Life to the Fullest. And of course, that secret ingredient is courage. And courage is, it's a topic that, I don't know, sometimes people think it's just courage is something that we do when we have to do something that maybe we're afraid to do. But I think it's a lot deeper than that. I think courage is sometimes the thing we have to do. We have to use to do things we don't necessarily want to do.
Right.
And so I recently gave this TEDx talk in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it was all about the takeaway messages. Sometimes we just have to have the courage to have the courage.
Right. And you definitely have a story to that, right? It's just not about courage, but you have a story that's attached to that story, actually.
I do. Did you want me to talk about that story now, very briefly, encapsulate the topic?
I'm interested to know from the beginning, before South Africa or before the Lions.
Sure.
What was your childhood like?
Sure. So, I think we as kids we're born with courage and we're fearless. And if we want to do something or try something, we just go for it. It's, the older people in our lives usually holding us back. But we're relentless. Babies babies start off, they can't even sit up, and then they learn to sit, and then they learn to crawl and then walk, and they keep falling down, but they just keep getting back up. And unfortunately, as the older that we get, sometimes the more often we fall down, the less likely we are to get ourselves back up. So yeah, in my case, speaking of South Africa, when I was a kid, I wasn't really interested in like princess stories or Barbie dolls. I was always just buried in the pages of a National Geographic magazine, particularly the African editions with lions and elephants and all those other magical animals there in your country. And if I wasn't, and I used to cut out the little pictures of those animals and write little stories and paste them in. This is when I was really young, maybe 5 or 6 years old. And one day, I brought one of those little stories down to the dining room table, and I gave it to my dad, the retired naval officer. And he started reading it out loud, but soon he was laughing so hard, and so was everybody else. And I just felt so ashamed, embarrassed, stupid. Like, I think we all know that feeling sometimes when we've done something that's close to our heart that we felt proud of, but the world sees it very differently. And so I really just gave up on my passion to write kind of then, and just got realistic and practical moving forward after that, because I was passionate about writing stories and whatnot. And it was about 30 years later that I just happened into this dusty little used bookshop on Main Street on my lunch break. And I opened up the door, and there, staring at me on the battered yellow cover of a National Geographic magazine, was an African lion. And I just was instantly brought back. And I thought, gosh, like, what happened to that dream? It just, like, that was 30 years ago already. It feels like it was yesterday, but whatever happened to that dream of going to this magical place and seeing these magical animals? And so I just started to put together a plan that day. It took 6 months or so, but to go back to Africa and volunteer in South Africa with with the Big Five.
Right.
Yeah. And so when I got to South Africa, I volunteered at a project called Indlevu, just off the Garden Route. The Garden Route.
Sorry, before South Africa, what were you doing back then at home?
Oh, so I was a project manager for the Olympics, the Vancouver 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. So, and event management, so putting together large scale sporting events, corporate events, but mostly the sporting events like the Olympics and Grey Cup and things like that.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, with your, like, did you just decide to go to South Africa, or there was some sort of a program that you had to get involved to go there? Did you just leave?
No, I knew that I wanted to go. I wanted to actually go and be as close to the animals as I could, and have something to do while I was there, rather than just going to a game reserve. So I did start actively researching projects, and the company I found was called Edge of Africa, and they have a number of volunteer projects around the country in all different types of areas, not just animals, but and they had outstanding reviews. So that's what I decided to sign up on one of their Big Five conservation projects.
Right. And what traits were they looking for for you to be accepted to the project?
So basically, you just had to be open and willing to do whatever job came about, and not and realize that you're far away from. Realize that you're far away from home, and like that. You'll be sleeping in a tent, for example, and just had to be open and willing, and not be a drama queen, basically, I think.
Right. And before that, what were you trying to achieve, or some sort of, did you had a goal of what you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah, I always wanted to write. That started, yeah, when I was very young, I always wanted to write stories, and it never really went away. But I mean, I always thought about it over the years. But just, yeah, kind of people around me would always say, it's not practical. And, I was really pushed into business, of course. And yeah, I was just writing was sort of like, there's no time for that. It's just not practical. You need to concentrate on your job and, working, you just put your chin down, work hard, that sort of thing. So,
Right.
yeah.
So now let's move to South Africa. What was the first impression? Or have you ever been here before you came for the project that time?
I did, and I was there a couple of years before that. And that time I was in a different area. I was in Durban, and in that time I was I went there to a few game reserves, and while it was beautiful and lovely, I felt like I was really still at arm's length and wasn't really very involved. I was just more observing. So this time I knew that I really wanted to come back and be a lot more involved and, yeah, active in my time there rather than just sitting in the back of a Jeep driving around.
Right. And then now, when you arrived for the project, now what was the very first job to do?
The first job. So the very first job to do, I remember it was about sunrise, and the park ranger came to pick me up for my tent camp, and where I was actually the only volunteer there at the time, and he came to pick me up, and we got in the Jeep, this open air Jeep. I remember we just came around this bend and sort of over this crest, and it was one of those beautiful, like nowhere else in the world, African sunrises, the lavenders, the purples, the red, the orange, the golds. This was like, oh my gosh. And I remember at that, and then in the distance, I could see silhouettes of elephants and that morning misty fog. And I remember at that moment thinking, you know what, I'm no longer reading the pages of a National Geographic, I'm actually in them. And it was just, just the most amazing feeling. Yeah. And then he, a couple of minutes later, he parked the Jeep and he says, okay, get out. And so I got out, and then he passed me this old rusty shovel. The thing must have weighed about 20 pounds. And he said, right, so time to shovel shit. I said, excuse me? And he said, yeah, we got to shovel elephant shit. You ever shoveled elephant shit? And I said, no. And he goes, well, it's pretty heavy, but you'll get used to it. and that was literally the first job, that we had to go and like shovel all this elephant dung and put it in wheelbarrows and pile it because it would later be used for fertilizer. But yeah, so that was the very first job, go all the way to Africa to shovel shit.
But had you done anything heavy previously, like some hardcore jobs, physical?
Nothing like this. No, most of the time the extent of my adventure was from behind a desk.
Right. Yeah, not a very smooth change, eh? Very
very different,
abrupt,
very
yeah.
different. Yes. That first day, within about 15 minutes, I remember the very first thing he gave me was this beautiful pair of like butter yellow leather work gloves and this nice like shirt that said conservation or something on it. I remember I felt so proud, like, oh my gosh, look at this uniform I've got. Like, I am the shit. I am so important. Not really important, but like I've really arrived. I'm going to do really like groundbreaking, important work here. And then a few minutes later, he's handing me a rusty old shovel, and he says, yeah, go shovel that shit over there. And I remember after about 20 minutes, my gloves were like covered in dung, and they were so wet, and my shirt was covered in like straw and sweat and I don't even know what else. And all my gloves were like falling off. I couldn't even keep them on end, like throwing the things like over my shoulder and just using my raw hands. And I was like, this is not what I came to Africa for. But you know what? This is it. But it was I have this, and I didn't know how I was going to make it through the day. And it was about, I don't know, 11 hours of like really tough physical labor that day. And I always say, you know what, that was the best work day of my life. It was the best day of my life. Yeah, truly.
And then there was a point where you had to come out of the truck, and I think you had to pick something up when the tiger or something was very close. What happened that day?
Oh, yeah. So that was great. So, uh, when I very first got there, my boss, this ranger, he was kind of running me through everything that I was going to have to do when I was there and things to get used to and whatnot. And one of the things he said was, "You're going to have to learn to play with a lion's testicles here." And I was like, "Excuse me, like, uh, what the hell? I'm not going to do that. I'm not crazy." And he says it's a local expression. It means you're going to have to draw on your courage. You're going to have to be a lion, like no longer a chicken. Like you're gonna, and like really call on your courage and maybe do things you're not used to doing. And so day after day we're sort of doing all these different jobs. Always kept that in mind, like this might not have been the picture of what I thought I was doing, or and not even really so much that I loved every job, but it was just things that I'd never done before. Mucking out crocodile pits, I mean, all kinds of things. And on this one particular day, we were out tracking a cheetah. And this cheetah, he said, well, this cheetah is very aggressive, and but even though the cheetah, they hunt their own food there, they do require supplementation. And so we had this huge cow's leg in the back of the Jeep that we had injected full of calcium. And we tracked her after a few hours, and then he parked the Jeep, and then he said, "Okay, drag that piece of meat out of the back, and then hurry back to the Jeep." And the cheetah's about 100 feet away or so, and I said, "Me? Like what? Why don't you do it?" And he said, "Well, come on, like it's time now, like come on." And so I was like, okay. And then so I got out and I pulled out this cow's leg. And this cheetah, I mean, she really was fearless. She's already coming towards us, like snarling and spitting and hissing. And I was just like, and one thing he had taught me is like, out here, animals, they smell fear. If you're weak, that when animals smell weakness in another animal, that's when they know that they're prey and they can jump on them and kill them. But if you're strong, they won't even notice you. They won't even. So I don't know. Just for some in that moment, I was just like, you know what? I'm actually not going to just run back to the Jeep. I'm going to stand my ground with the cheetah. And so she came closer and closer and closer, and I just stood my ground. Every time I had that feeling like, oh shit, maybe I should run, I was just, no, you know what? I'm not going to run. This is bigger than just this moment right here with this cheetah, and this can potentially be life-changing. So yeah, that cheetah came up and she just snatched that leg right out of my hands and disappeared. So it was really, really, really cool. Incredibly stupid as well, but really, really cool.
So, since you've been with the animals out there, from the outside, it seems like if you come close to a wild animal, it's just gonna hop off and try to hunt you. That's like, at least from the, I've never been that close with a cheetah or anything dangerous like that. Um,
Mhm.
how do animals react when you're very close to them? Are they constantly hunting for you, or how does that work?
I mean, of course, I think it depends on a number of factors. Is the animal hungry? But generally speaking, most animals are more afraid of us than we are of them. Um, One thing um, that ranger taught me out there, because we did some wilderness survival as well, and of course we never had guns out there. We never carried guns. They didn't have any there. But he said if you were out in the wild and you had a gun with only one bullet, but there were lions, you knew there were lions around, more than one lion around, and they were hungry and prowling, what would you do? You only have one bullet. And I said, well, I don't know. And he goes, very simple. You point your gun to the sky and you shoot it, and all those all those animals are going to be so scared they'll take off, and that's all you do, because animals are very skittish. they very much live in that fight or flight, and most animals would rather flight than fight, especially when it comes to humans. I mean, we are the super predator. That being said, I would never say to somebody, take a walk out there amongst the pride of lions and you'll be fine. No, absolutely not saying that. But it's not also not to say that. I mean, for example, I used to have a phobia of sharks. And I really wanted to learn to scuba dive, but I was so terrified that, oh my gosh, if I'm ever in the water and there's a shark in the water, it's going to come up and attack me and kill me and eat me alive. And one of my friends said, just because there's a shark in the water doesn't mean it's going to come along and eat you. And I said, yeah, you know what? You're right. Like, we're so focused on that fear and the worst case scenario. And so I did get my diving certificate, and I've since been diving in the South Pacific many times, in very close vicinity to sharks, seeing sharks, and I'm the one like chasing the shark, like, hey, get back here. This is super cool. I want to see you a little bit closer. And the shark's like, swimming away as fast as he can. Like, oh my gosh, there's one of those super predators, a human. Let's get out of here. And I actually did the cage dive in South Africa in Mussel Bay with the great whites.
Yes, yeah, a lot of great whites over there.
Yeah, and that was really cool to see a great white shark so close, and to see that those are just such beautiful, graceful creatures. I mean, I wouldn't want to swim in the open water with them, but when you see them up close and realize, they're actually maybe not just out here to kill us at the first chance they get.
Exactly, yeah, and they're huge, eh? When they, crossing through your cage, you realize how big they are.
Oh, so big and just so beautiful and so graceful and powerful. And yeah, just incredible. You have so many beautiful things there. So many beautiful, incredible things there.
Have you ever been at a situation in the bush where you nearly lost your limb or your life or just being threatened?
No.
Oh, wow. Where were you sleeping there? In the tents all the time?
Yeah, I was sleeping in the tent all the time, but there was an electrical wire fence around the camp, and they said it really just serves as a mental block to the animals. I mean, most of those animals could just jump over it. It was only, maybe 5 feet tall or something, but they won't, because again, they're not. It's not like they're saying, well, let's go in there and eat those humans alive. They're not. I mean, most animals are more afraid of us than we are of them.
So what was then your day-to-day responsibility in the bush?
Gosh, that was one of the questions I asked when I was thinking about what does my day-to-day look like, and they said, it's anything that comes at you out there, because it's always changing. So we would do, like, the very first thing we always did was patrol the reserve, looking for sick or injured animals. While I was there, actually, this was back in 2010, that little corner of South Africa, they said, got hit with one of the worst rainstorms in over a century. And I'm from Vancouver, which is a rainforest. So like what's rain in some parts of the world, I'm like, this is nothing for Vancouver. I mean, we get rained on usually 9 months a year here, heavy rain. But it did rain a lot, and so a number of roads were washed out. I mean, pits flooded, that sort of thing. So a lot of it was a cleanup effort. I mean, we were rebuilding roads by hand, like with stones, or mucking out crocodile pits. It just tree planting in the Lions camp. I mean, was another great example. Actually, we were planting trees, and the ground there is so drought-ridden and dry. And we're using these pickaxes to break the ground to plant trees and the little seedlings. And there's like 3 lions only maybe 100 meters away, just laying there watching us, no fence between us, and really no interest in us as we're planting trees. Of course, I never took one eye off those lions, but yeah. So there's all different types of things. A lot of physical labor. And as I said, just loved every single second of it. It was amazing. Just a really awesome, wonderful, wonderful experience. Yeah.
So, do these animals look at you as a threat or as food, as a as prey? I don't really understand what would strike if they can be as calm as that at that distance. I still don't understand what kind of strikes them to attack.
That's a good question. I think one, I think some of that goes back to what that ranger taught me when I first got there was about fear and how animals can smell it. And they can smell it. There is chemical that we release animals, whether that human or any type of animal, when we're afraid or fearful. There is a chemical that is released, and animals can sense it because they're much more advanced, I think, in some ways than we are. And when they smell that fear, they see weakness, and that is when they will go after a prey. But if they don't smell that fear, they're probably not interested generally. As I said, like, I'm not saying to anybody, oh, if you're fearless, you're not going to get attacked. Absolutely not. But it goes very much, like, we have dogs, and I've always had dogs, and mostly German Shepherds. And dogs are a different example. They're a domesticated animal, but it's the same type of thing. So if, like, little kids, if they're around dogs and they say, oh my gosh, a dog, and they start screaming and running away, what does the dog do? It chases the kid and starts jumping on them, right? Because, oh, you're all excited, you're afraid, you're something, so I better come and, jump on you and calm you down, or what's going on? Like, the dog gets all excited and like that too. But I always say to the kids, like, okay, just stand still, deep breaths, chill. The dog stands still, takes deep breaths, chills, right? So they'll mimic your behavior.
Right.
They sense that.
Where I grew up, we use the same strategy with dogs because people keep dogs for security, not for companionship. So it's just like on every block or on every house, almost anybody has a dog, and they're like free range outside guarding the home. And it's pretty, we use the same strategy of saying, look, if you pretend to be fearful or you're fearful, you're trying to run, that's when they would actually chase you. If you just walk straight up without showing any kind of fear, you typically used to be okay. But those who used to run obviously were the ones being attacked often. So I guess it's kind of the same. It's related to the same thing that you're talking about fear.
Absolutely. It's exactly the same. It's no different. Yep. It's no different.
So what happened after your adventure? Because you have been looking to do that all your life since you was young.
Yes.
Wasn't that like, okay, I'm done now. I'm just gonna go back home and sleep. I've lived the dream now, isn't it?
Um, actually, no. So what happened was, it was so life changing in so many ways. As I said, I was doing things I'd never done before, and just really pushed out of my comfort zone every single day, and just being open and willing, and not complaining. Like, from the very beginning, I mean, it could have said, well, actually, you know what? I didn't come all the way to Africa to shovel elephant dung, so I'm not going to do this. What else can we do? Like, that would have been a failing attitude. So it was like every day I was like, hey, we got to do this. You got to, be up to your chest height in mud in a crocodile pit. There may be one or two in there, with a machete, just chopping reeds. So naturally, going into some type of an environment or experience where it changes you. You don't have to go to Africa to do that, or the other side of the world. It could be any situation where it just changes you completely and turns your beliefs upside down on their head. It's going to change you, and it's going to change you, I think, for the better. You're going to grow. And so what happened when I was there is I actually started at night, because I would just hang out in my tent at night. I had just a little camp light in there. And I started to write again. And I started to write, about what I was experiencing there. And I hadn't written like that in 25 years. I hadn't done any writing unless it was, a proposal for work or something, business related. And so when I got back home, I I wanted to continue writing. I wanted to actually finish a book that had always been my dream from that day at the dining room table when I threw away that dream when I was 6. And but there was a lot of resistance. I was like, okay, well, this is just stupid. It's a waste of time. I'm never going to make a penny. And then I was like, gosh, this is just all resistance. And what if I just kind of had that same attitude? It's like, what if I just did it because it makes me happy? What if I just did it because it makes me feel satisfied? What if I just did it because I don't think I can do it? Which is all the things I learned in South Africa, your beautiful country. And so I just kept writing every night. I kept writing, and of course, I had a lot of resistance and a lot of as they call it, the inner critic saying you can't do this and you suck at this. But I just kept pushing through. I thought this can't be as terrifying as standing off with a cheetah or being in a cage with great whites. But actually, sometimes the battles with yourself are more terrifying. Anyway, so after about 6 months or so, I finished that book, and I called it Learning to Play with a Lion's Testicles.
I'm curious about why did you call it that?
I called it that because that was the expression I learned on my first day in South Africa, that I had to be willing to play with a lion's testicles. And and I thought it was so crazy, but that really just encapsulated not just my time there, but I think just life. We have to be willing to play with the lion's testicles. We have to be willing to call on our courage and do the things that scare the shit out of us, perhaps, or terrify us, and just be willing to do it because we're going to grow from it. If it's something that it's important to us, rather than, stay on the sidelines or hide in the tent or whatever it might be. So I thought, yeah, this really encapsulates that whole experience of just learning to play with lion's testicles. So that's why I chose that title.
Right. And then after you wrote the book, is that the exact time you left South Africa, or you wrote the book and stayed there for some time?
No, I started to write when I was in South Africa, and then I went back to Canada, and I kept writing here in Canada. So yeah, I finished the book here in Canada. I mean, I wrote most of it here. So yes, yeah, I wrote most of it here in Canada.
One of the questions that maybe some listeners might have, including myself as well, is when you're doing this kind of project, how do you finance yourself?
So, I had, once I decided this was something I really wanted to do, I've researched all the costs. How much is it going to cost to go there? How much time am I going to have to take away from work? And I just started saving, and of course, cutting out things like, okay, it's not necessary. What can I cut out to save to do this? So that's what I did. I just made a budget and planned for it. And yeah, that's how to do it. Just make a budget, plan for it, so that then you have the funds to do it, to go. Yeah.
Right. And then after the book, what happened with you and Jimmy Fallon?
So I was very fortunate. My book actually did get published by a publisher in the States. And I remember just a few days before my book was coming out, I phoned the publisher and I said, I don't want my book to come out. How can we stop this? And she said, what? And I said, I'm just terrified. Oh my gosh, like once that book goes out there, I'm going to be judged. People are going to be writing reviews. It's a really nasty review. And what if it fails? What if nobody buys it? What if they say, oh my gosh, had this terrible writer ever get published and she's just a fraud, and all those things? It was just terrifying. And she said, you know what? She goes, you're so cute. And I said, excuse me? She goes, you and every other first-time author goes through this. And she goes, not only first time author, but anybody who ever is going to put themselves out there for people to judge or whatever, or as Brene Brown calls, anytime you step into the arena instead of just sitting in the stands, you are probably going to get beaten up. You are probably, of course, people are going to give you negative reviews, and there's going to be that. There's no way around it. She said, but would you rather sit in the stands or be in the arena? And she goes, you want to be in the arena, and that's why you did this. And she said, you know what? You're going to have to learn to develop the skin of a rhinoceros. And that made a lot of sense. That visual image, yeah, you got to have the skin of a rhinoceros to weather that. And you know what? To hell with other people's opinions. If the people it doesn't matter. You do something because you want to do it, and don't worry about pleasing other people or the people who are going to criticize you or whatever. They don't matter. They really don't. So what happened? So the book came out, and about 3 months later, I woke up early one morning, and I saw an email from a friend, and she said, I saw your book on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon last night. Hilarious. And I thought, what? Late Night with Jimmy Fallon? So for any of your listeners who don't know, the Late Night with Jimmy Fallon show at the time was the number one nighttime talk show, I guess you called it. He's a comedian. He's very funny and talented, and he's got a few million viewers every night. And so I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Wow. How did I not know he was going to have my book on the show? And well, this is great. So I clicked on the link and I began to watch, and it starts off with this little jingle that says the segment, and it says, it's a little song, and they say, do not waste your money on these books. And it's Jimmy Fallon's top 10 do not read list. And I've seen a show a bunch of times, but I never have seen this do not read list before. And I said, oh, Jesus. Okay, well, maybe this is the list that he does before he does the top 10 do read list or something. And he starts off and he holds up the first book, number 10 on his list. And, he makes a joke about the cover or the author or something like that. And then the whole audience laughs hysterically. And then he goes to book number 9, number 8, number 7. And even though I know he's a comedian and this is all in fun and everything, it was just like that inner critic was just saying, you are the biggest idiot. I mean, if, 30 years ago, it was 6 people around a dining room table. Now it's millions laughing at you and what you created. And you're just a laughing stock, because it's actually a pretty serious book, dealing with a number of issues, death and grieving, all kinds of stuff. So I just felt so stupid. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's just going to be number 5 or number 4, and he's just going to run through it pretty quickly, at least. But he gets to book number 3, and I'm like, okay, let's just hope it's going to be number 2. Just don't be number 1. Just don't be number 1. But my book was number 1 on his do not read list.
Of course, yeah. It was a joke, yeah?
Well, yeah, of course. He was just making fun of the title, of course, because, come on, a book on learning to play with a lion's testicles. If you don't know the context of it, it is pretty funny, of course. So, yeah, I did have that momentary feeling of humiliation and everything else. But that's just because we all have a backstory, right? So our backstories have a way of coming up with buttons and everything else. It only took me a few minutes to go, you know what, actually, this is not a bad thing. This is a great thing, because that right there is Jimmy Fallon is on that stage playing with my lion's testicles book. And, it just shows that I actually did it, that I overcame that inner voice that kept saying that you can't do it, you can't do it, you can't write and everything else. So this is just a huge, display that I can do it and I did do it. So this is great. This is not a bad thing at all.
Right. So, you know, uh, in your story, there's a lot to learn about courage there.
Hmm.
But when I would like to know, when did you felt less courageous to do something? And what did you do after going to South Africa and back? Was there a moment where you felt less courageous at all?
Yeah, you know what? I right there actually in that moment, when my book was number one and like hearing of like everyone's laughing and stuff. And of course, by this time, I've got emails coming in and texts from people saying, "Don't jump off the bridge. It's not that bad. Hopefully, nobody saw it," and and things like that. And um, so in that, I did have a few moments right there where I felt less great. I kind of was questioning, like, oh my gosh, now like and feeling less courageous and but then I was like, as I said, I just said, you know what, this is not a bad thing, this is a good thing. So I actually went online a few minutes later and or a few hours later, whatever, and I said, thank Jimmy Fallon does this thank you skit thing. He writes thank you notes to people, like funny things he does. So I made up my own little thank you skit video for Jimmy Fallon and thanking him for, giving me something to brag about to my mother-in-law, silencing her for once, um, getting my website more hits than Kim Kardashian's naked butt shot, which also came out that week. Just silly things like that, just having fun with it. So yeah, it's just everything's a matter of perspective. I mean, we can very quickly to convince ourselves something's really bad, but it's only bad if we think it is, right? So that takes courage, I believe, to reposition that and silence that inner critic. So
Yeah. So, what did they the sales go up after that video? I guess.
they yeah, they did for a little while, and it was great exposure, and it's just such a great it truly just such a gift because the story is one that people will like, okay, well, I don't want to, gosh, I'm really afraid of to do something. What if like somebody laughs at me, or what if somebody like calls me out or something? Like, okay, well, I had the situation where a few million people were laughing at the book that took me 25 years to write. And, but you know what? It's a great thing. It's a great thing. Just do it anyway. So it's a great story and it's a lot of fun. And as I said, I'm a huge fan of Jimmy Fallon to begin with. So no, it's great. Yeah.
I Well, I would consider myself a courageous person, but if there's one thing that I feel insecure about is writing a book, definitely. I think about it, but
Hmm.
I have like 200 reasons to tell myself that I'm not good enough to write one. I don't
Really.
I don't know if that's what I don't know if anybody who would attempt to write for the first time would feel like. I don't know. Did that ever come across your mind at one point?
Absolutely. Gray, what you're talking about, that feeling terrified to write a book, there's an author by the name of Steven Pressfield, and he wrote a book called uh, The War of Art, The War of Art, which is a play on the title of The Art of War, The War of Art. And he talks about resistance and the inner critic. And so he's really specifically talking to writers and people who would like to write because they say 82% of people would like to write a book, but fewer than 1% ever actually do. And that's because of this fear. So, for example, what are some of your fears? Like, what are some of your 200 reasons why you won't write a book or can't write a book?
I think they're all in in my head. It just feels like too much, something too big for me to do, or too much. Just like okay, I think it's that feeling of is what I want to write good enough or even worth writing, or
Mhm.
who wanna read that book, for example.
Right?
So yeah, so it's I don't know. It's just little things like that. I guess it's all in my head. If I write it on paper, there's absolutely no reason to not do it. But it
Yeah.
just feels too big for me to do. That maybe I'm not there yet to even write one. If you know what I mean.
I absolutely know what you mean. This is, just another trick that this resistance, so Steven Pressfiled calls it, I call it the inner critic, um, plays on us, is that if we get so focused on the end result of something, like for example, as you said, okay, we'll use your example. Well, I think it's too big, like to think like to write a book is such a big project and it's overwhelming to think like, how would I do that? Of course, when you're focused on the end result, it does seem overwhelming. And well, what if nobody reads it? What if all that? I mean, there's always going to be a million reasons. But instead, if we can stick to the present moment and say, I have this desire to write. It's something that's within me, so it's obviously important to me. So why don't I just honor that and start from there? So what can I write today as part of this? And just start just be in the moment, just moment by moment, instead of so focused. Well, what if, like, for example, somebody wants to start a business? Well, what if it doesn't make $1 million? What if it's not super successful? What if I fail? Somebody wants to lose 100 pounds. Well, what if, I mean, my gosh, I'll never lose 100 pounds, but could you lose a pound? Well, yeah. So start with that, right? So that's, I think, is one of the keys, is how we get around it, is to start really small. There's always going to be excuses. Once you think you've gotten past one, that resistance is going to throw another 100 at you. So that's why you just got to be present in the moment. A trick that I used, Gray, when I was writing my book, because I had, like you said, you have 200 reasons. Well, I had about 200,000 reasons not to write. And, number one being, in my family, it was anything that was of a creative pursuit was a waste of time. That is not important. That is not relevant. You go to work, you put your chin down, you do your job, and, be a good citizen, all that other stuff. And anything else is frivolous, ridiculous. Dreams belong to the dreamers. That's for dream time. You are not a dreamer. You are not important. And so I had like all that sort of stuff too. So what I would do, how did I get around that? So beside my desk, I kept a huge piece of paper on the wall. And every time I try to sit down and start to write, of course, all those things would go, why am I doing this? I'm wasting my time. And I'd say, okay, hold on a minute. Wait, that's the voice of resistance. So just a minute. I go over to that big piece of paper and say, now tell me that again. What was the reason? Oh, okay, this is a waste of time. And I actually write that on the piece of paper. This is a waste of time. Then I come back to the computer. Well, and also, no one's ever going to read this shit. Okay, there's another one. No one's going to read this shit. Anything else? And I just get all of that nonsense, all those excuses out of my head onto that piece of paper. And once that little voice was heard, then I go back to my computer. And now my mind was at least clear for the next hour. Okay, now I can write something. Because I got all those excuses. I gave that voice a time and a place to be heard, to put all that shit on a piece of paper. And then I go back and write. And every time I'd write, I'd have to do that first, get it all out of my head. And then I'd take that big piece of paper outside, because it would get full pretty fast, and I'd burn the bitch. Light it up. Because you know what? It is so, now that writing is worthless and not worth anything. I'd like put it up in flames and then come back to work. So this is very common. We all have that. But find your way to give that an outlet, so then you can let the stuff that you want to come out.
Right. Thanks for your words of encouragement. I should actually get started with that at one point, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm one thing that I wanted to ask you was that, for most people who would want to make moves, like go to a different country, experience something new, they have attachments, or commitments or people behind. How did you had anything like that, and how did you went through it? Say, I'm leaving anything or anyone else, and then I'm just gonna be on my own somewhere.
This is this could be a tricky thing, especially once you have a family and commitments that are really tough to leave, to find the time. So I think. For example, right now I have 2 young children, so I can't just go and live in a tent in South Africa for a few months, even though God knows I'd love to sometimes, just for the peace and quiet. But it's not practical. So what can I do? Well, I can plan maybe 5 years from now, I'll take one of my daughters and we'll go together for a couple of weeks. Or maybe, if I plan really well and make sure and put everything into place to make this happen, maybe I can go for a couple of weeks on my own in a year from now or something. So just to try to, we just have to get creative of how we can make things happen rather than not make them happen. Now I don't have as much time to write as I'd like. It's, now I normally have to write between 4 and 6 a.m. Before the day starts. And that doesn't happen every day. That happens just on days when I don't need that sleep, which isn't as often as I'd like. But what can I do? So to have that creative outlet, I make up stories with my kids. We do it together. So then I can exercise that creative muscle. So it's very different, but we still have to find a way to exercise that muscle to make things happen. So we just have to adjust. We just have to find creative ways to make things happen. Be focused on, there's a way I can make it happen. I just have to find that way.
Right. Thanks, Melissa, for your time. It was absolutely awesome chatting to you and having a more detailed story about South Africa and what you did here. And for the people listening, they can obviously check out your TEDx talk. I'll put a link. I'll put a link in the description. So, where else and how can people find you?
I have a website that is just melissahaynes.com. And yeah, of course, if any of your listeners ever want to reach out and email me and chat about anything, their inner critics and how to overcome that, or anything at all, please reach out. Love to hear your stories and have a conversation.
Where can one find some of your photos in South Africa with animals, if you have any?
Oh, I have hundreds. And website as well. There's a tab there called African Photos, and they're all right there.
All right. Is there anything else you want to share?
I just want to express my gratitude, Gray, for your time and also to your country. It's such a beautiful place. It really is a very special and wonderful place. And yeah, just thank you very much for your time. And it's just been lovely to have this conversation with you.
No problem. I really appreciate your time. And when you say this is an amazing country, why did you leave?
Why did I leave?
Yeah.
Well, I had to go back to work. But I'll be back. I will be back. I will be back, and I want to come back in a similar type capacity, not just as a tourist, but, to just get closer to the people and the animals again. And I just love it. It's just a really wonderful, beautiful place in so many ways, and so rich and so diverse. And I know you have your struggles, obviously, as well. But it's a really great country, and people just have so much resilience there to overcome so much. And the rest of the world can learn a lot from you.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Melissa. Have an amazing... Is it daytime there right now?
It is. It's almost 10 o'clock in the morning.
Oh, yeah, sure. Have an amazing day. Chat to you later.
Thank you, Gray.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
And with that, thank you for listening to the Craft Podcast. And we just came up with some 1980s television voice. And Gray, how can they subscribe to the podcast to stay relevant? They can do it in many ways. They can subscribe through iTunes, which is what I recommend. And you can leave me a review on iTunes. It helps a lot, actually, when you leave a review and a 5-star rating. So you can do that, as well as on SoundCloud, or on Stitcher Radio, on TuneIn. And if you're on SoundCloud, I recommend that you click that repost button. And you can also share it on your social media, everyone. So I appreciate your time listening. Thanks, and have a nice day or evening. See you on the next one.